Welcome, everybody. I'd love to introduce William Anderegg from University of Utah, who's been doing a lot of work to understand large-scale patterns of forest evolution, deforestation, all that, like the health of forestry across the planet. Welcome, William.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to give an overview of how we use different modeling tools to understand and project and ultimately try to forecast the future of Earth's forests in the 21st century. So kind of a quick three parts today here. We're going to set the stage with some of the stressors that Earth's forests face in a changing climate. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the physical-based models and kind of leaning on these fundamentals of physiology that we use to model climate responses from small scales of cells up to whole ecosystems. And then I'll talk at some of the larger scale work, and a lot of this is some's more physical and a lot's more kind of empirical or statistical of modeling risks to forests, particularly from fire, drought, and some of these other climate stresses. So very, very rapid context, of course, we're running this massive, unprecedented experiment on our planet by increasing temperatures due to greenhouse gas emissions. And for Earth's forests, they're really kind of perched on this knife edge between two opposing sets of forces due to climate change. This is the Amazon rainforest at dawn. This is taken from the top of one of these NASA towers that was really set up to try to measure the health and breathing of these tropical rainforests. And on one hand, you know, the rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere can benefit plants and let them do more photosynthesis and potentially grow more, take up more carbon out of the atmosphere. Earth's forests currently take up about a quarter of the CO2 that people put up every single year and slow the speed of climate change. And this CO2 fertilization effect we think is important, is likely to continue somewhat in the 21st century. But on the flip side, the other set of forces are the stresses of climate change, really the fires, droughts, pests and pathogens, temperature impacts, storms and hurricanes. And these can overwhelm the benefits of CO2 and drive forest mortality and die-off events. And kind of when and where each of these sets of forces is going to dominate is really the kind of multi-trillion-dollar question, both for a lot of communities and a lot of the ecosystem services that we rely on, but also for the speed of climate change itself. Obviously, if forests stop taking up CO2, they could even lose CO2 to the atmosphere. That would accelerate the speed of climate change. And in fact, the future of Earth's forests in our best tools is massively uncertain. So this is just a quick overview figure showing you the change in terrestrial carbon storage in ecosystems. And this is really dominated by forests. In two different climate scenarios, the blue scenario is a low climate change scenario and the red is a high climate change scenario. And this is really kicking off in about the year 2010. And what you can see is the uncertainty of where we might end up this century is just massive. And it goes anywhere from a large increase in carbon storage at the upper end to losses in carbon at the lower end. And if anything, these models are probably far more optimistic. I think most scientists working in this area think this probably has a lot bigger downside that these models don't capture, because they actually do the CO2 effects very well and don't do the climate stresses very well. So this could range from this huge range of scenarios. And of course, this isn't hypothetical, because we're seeing these climate stresses play out around us every summer, every wildfire season, in basically most forests around the globe. So the key questions that we try to understand in my group is, how can we improve the predictions of how individual trees respond using these fundamental biophysics of physiology, plant physiology and ecology? How can we use models to scale those individual responses up to whole ecosystems and ultimately the globe? And then what do we do with that information? How can we leverage this understanding and this information to inform decision making? And I'll give some case studies here using forests as nature-based climate solutions towards the end. So I really see our work as kind of these three different domains of the physiology of plant climate responses, which also involves quite a bit of modeling, the scaling from tissues to ecosystems, and the nature-based climate solutions. Okay, so now to jump into some of the actual modeling that we do after setting the stage. We have a fairly strong mechanistic understanding of how plant physiology works and how forests interact with the atmosphere and the climate. And we tend to conceptualize a lot of this in pools and fluxes. This is a really nice diagram of a lot of the fluxes of energy, water, and carbon that are really captured in our global models of ecosystems that go into these Earth system and climate models. The things I'll be talking a lot about today are really this fundamentally linked set of fluxes of water loss through transpiration and water up and carbon uptake through photosynthesis. And these are inherently coupled because they happen at the exact same site. They happen at these pair of cells on leaves called stomata. And stomata have massive leverage for everything from weather prediction to crop yields to forest responses to stress. Now, there's one other piece, which is that in order to do photosynthesis and keep leaves alive, plants also have to pipe water up to leaves. And this is this fundamental plant water transport biophysics called plant hydraulic transport. Plant circulatory systems are amazing. They don't have a heart or a pump. They're using the atmosphere as really this ultimate pump, and it's along these negative pressure gradients that pulls water up, and eventually it's lost through the stomata to the atmosphere. In normal times, this works beautifully. It's one of the most elegant systems possible that has really been the inspiration of a huge amount of technology. But during dry times, the system can fail. And really, when the soil's dry and the atmosphere is hotter and drier, these water columns, the tensions rise so much that small air bubbles called embolisms shoot in and block them. And ultimately, this is one of the main physical ways that trees die from drought stress, is when you have so much of the pipes of the water transport system blocked by air bubbles that can actually destroy trees. And we have all sorts of ways to measure this in the field and the lab. One of the most common ones is this approach of measuring this change in conductivity through a tissue as a function of that negative pressure. Basically, as you pull harder and harder, more air bubbles come in, and you have this sigmoidal drop in the conductivity, how much water you can pipe through the system. Okay, so this is the kind of the background of the physiology and the biophysics. One of the ways we've been working on is, can we really link the water transport to the water fluxes and carbon fluxes through stomata? This is an electron microscope of these pairs of cells of stomata on leaves. And can we do that with optimality theory? So can we build theoretical models, analytical models of how these ought to behave in a rapidly changing climate? And this is a really rich field that kind of goes back to the 60s and 70s of developing optimality theory. We recently proposed a new optimality theory that really links this water transport. And we can compare these, and I'm happy to go into any of these, but this is just to give you a quick overview of this. We can compare how well this optimality theory works compared to actual measurements of water fluxes. This is 34 woody species from around the world. And it works remarkably well at kind of the tissue or level. This is really measurements on individual leaves of how much, yeah, great, how open or closed these stomata are.
So now, in terms of drought impacts, this is now you have. It's not that the plant is just dying of thirst. It's that its ability to pull additional water in the future is long-term damage. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So this embolism process is very difficult to repair. We think that and this is actually one really key scientific frontier, is understanding kind of where are the tipping points and what's reversible damage and what's irreversible damage. What certainly seems to happen is above maybe 50 to 80% embolism in the tree is very likely to die. It's been a hard threshold to figure out, and it probably varies by species. But you really, it's hard to flush the air out of these systems, and often this embolism process results in a lot of tears to membranes, which are very, very difficult, because remember, most of this woody tissue that pipes water is actually dead cells. It's not living cells, and so once it's filled with air, it's very, very hard to repair. There are some cases, especially in roots and things like grasses, that can probably repair this, especially if they can get positive pressure from water in the soil to push out the air.
Right. And now, in terms of your optimality theory, are you thinking of some kind of like a idealized water transport channel that's powered by air pressure, like what the optimal design would be, or a different kind of model?
Yeah, so this is sort of an evolutionary. It's an optimality. Well, I guess maybe what I should say is we borrow all these kind of conceptions from economics, and this is a profit maximization optimization on carbon. So we're basically saying, what's the optimal behavior of these pores, of these leaf pores? If a tree wants to maximize its carbon uptake, we think that's kind of a good proxy for fitness. That's what you need for all of growth and reproduction, and avoid dying by this embolism process. And that's where the physiology of water transport, basically hooking up the pipes through plants to the water loss in leaves, is really crucial. So you're trying to maximize carbon profit, but not kill yourself by, drawing too much water from the soil and embolizing. The other thing I'll mention is a huge amount of this field is based in sort of a constrained optimization approach. Say you have a given pool of water to use, and what's the optimal way to use that water. One of the reasons why we think our optimization is a better one is that constrained optimization approach doesn't account for competition in the soil. So plants don't get to control their own bank account of water in the soil. It's just root systems actually in nature overlap immensely. And so this constrained optimization of a fixed pool of water in the soil probably doesn't make a ton of sense.
So you have like population level constraint, right? Because you have that competition.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's really kind of looking at how much water you can extract at a given time point, and you have competitors who might be better or worse at extracting that water from the same shared resource.
Got it. All right, thank you.
And so this is really kind of a leaf and stem level model, but then we've managed to scale this up to an individual tree level model. And this was work led by a former postdoc of mine, Martin Venturas, who's now a professor in Spain. And
one question. It looks like your slides are not moving on. Are you on the next slide?
Oh, I am on the next slide. That's interesting. Why?
Go back and forth a little bit. Maybe we'll see that update.
Can you see?
Yes, drought-driven mortality. We can see that now.
Okay.
Cool.
And now you see both a scatter plot and a kind of cartoon tree?
No, I don't see that.
Interesting.
And maybe you but we do see your video slow. Oh, now I see it. Good. So maybe you can call out whenever you change slides, and I'll let you know if we don't see it after a while.
Sounds great. And it seems like maybe there's a little lag. So
exactly. Yeah.
In any case, the next step we took was really to import.
It seems to be gone again, but I can't tell if it's the lag at my end.
What we'll do is post the slides afterwards. So worst case,
okay.
That.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
So the next step was really to develop this into a whole tree level model, and then to test this in a experimental setting. So the right hand schematic shows you all the different pieces of plants that we're modeling, and then some of the input variables, things like the wind, air temperature, how hot and dry the air is. And this is an individual tree level model that we developed and then tested using a whole suite of different plant physiology metrics. How much photosynthesis do these trees do? How much water do they lose? What's their leaf temperature? And you can see this embolism metric as well. And this is in a drought experiment of aspen trees here in Utah. So we can really test and try to deploy this model at a tree scale. And what was interesting is during this severe drought experiment, it also worked decently well for catching, I just did a slide change here to drought mortality, catching the probability of mortality at around this 80–85% loss of whole tree water transport. Now, of course, there's a large caveat. This is a very controlled setting. You can see a picture of the experiment here. And this is really kind of the best case scenario for these models. They're physically based. We have all the measurements to constrain them, and we can test them in very controlled circumstances. So the next question is, how well do these models actually work at capturing mortality of trees out in the real world in sort of natural settings and forests? So what we did was, next slide here, try to answer, how many of these variables are most important for predicting mortality, thinking about the physiological stress from these plant models, climate variables, and data about the forest itself, things like competition and stand density. Does adding in this mechanistic or process-based simulation improve mortality? And in general, how well can we predict regional climate-driven mortality patterns? Next slide here. So what we did for predicting regional tree mortality is we went to these long-term Forest Service measurement plots. It's called the Forest Inventory and Analysis. And when there's over 100,000 of these plots, we really took about 10,000 from 8 dominant Western US tree species. We use weather data over the measurement period in this mechanistic model to simulate how much stress and damage these trees we think should have experienced. And then we built some statistical models of mortality using a whole suite of different predictors, things like this physiological stress, but also climate and stand structure variables. You can see these are the dominant tree species here and where they're found, and the number of plots kind of overall and with mortality documented. So what we found was that, not surprisingly, this is kind of largely consistent with a number of other studies, is that the stand factors were most important for mortality models, but that climate and this physiological stress were often also really fairly important, often in the top 5 most important variables. And adding in this prediction of plant damage and embolism and hydraulic stress did improve the mortality prediction process. So this is the delta and information criterion for these different species. And in most species, it did improve the mortality prediction, not by as much as we were hoping. So the good news was, as we look at this mortality over the past 20 years from drought, the predicted versus observed mortality, we could explain about 52% of the variance in mortality patterns across all species. For kind of ecological and climate fields, that especially with things very noisy like mortality, this is a relatively decent, relatively strong model performance. You can see the models often over predict mortality somewhat. There's this kind of slope or slight bias towards over prediction of mortality. Now, the bad news is, I would say tree mortality prediction and modeling is still incredibly hard. So if we break this down by individual species, you can see actually there are some species, like in this top row in the middle graph, trembling aspen, where there's been a lot of drought-driven mortality, where we're only capturing about 8% of the mortality variation seen out in the Western US. And in part, I think this is because the real world is so much more complex than our models are able to capture. And we know that a lot of complexity around hydrology and water movement in the soil. There's a lot of complexity and I think important contributions of pests and pathogens, these biotic agents that often can drive mortality or at least accelerate mortality. And we're not simulating those in these models yet. So this is probably some of the reason why some of our predictions don't work so well in many species.
So question about this. So FIA has information about like cause of death, and I'm assuming that this is that, do you say that this tree died, or when they say it's died because of bugs, you say, well, we don't count that one as death or something like that? How do you adjust for the multi reasons for death?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the FIA data set does try to assign a proximal mortality agent. And we use that information primarily to exclude human causes of death. If somebody went and cut down a tree, we obviously don't want to count that. And we also use it to exclude things like wildfire. If there was a timber thinning or a wildfire, we're not modeling that here either. Now, the unfortunate part is the cause of death is not very good for drought. It's not very widely used, and usually drought mortality is kind of classified as an other category or as an insect category. And so we kind of use this as, let's exclude things that are clearly not climate or drought driven, like fire and timber cutting or people. But then we're not able to specifically just model the drought mortality. This is kind of all the mortality that could potentially be drought. And that's really combining insects and drought, which often do kind of co-occur in the wild.
Okay, and so you don't have a good model of insect mortality or insect prevalence. So that's why a lot of the error is the insect effects.
That's right. And actually, I think in the next model I'm going to tell you about, we dug deeper into the insect piece and started to try to model that directly, because there is, in this proximate mortality code, there are often insects coded as saying we think that this was a bark beetle driven tree death. And so in our next analysis, we did actually try to dig into this insect question separately.
All right, excellent. Thank you.
Okay. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of our modeling from leaf tissues up to whole forest stands. So now I'm going to take a step larger and think about modeling some of these risks at larger scales, and with this case study of forests as nature-based climate solutions. Just a very quick overview of what these are. You've probably heard of these, but nature-based climate solutions are really trying to increase carbon storage in forests through human activities. And this is maybe avoiding deforestation to begin with. This could be tree planting and reforestation efforts. It could be agroforestry, or changing management in a way that improves carbon storage. This is often called improved forest management. There's a huge amount of interest in this. Obviously, forests bring many of these benefits that we care about, but there's a lot of interest in leveraging this in corporate and government climate targets and climate policies. So how much these are used in sort of paths to net zero, this is receiving a lot of interest. And for forests and nature-based climate solutions to work, they really have to accomplish four fundamental things. They have to first cool the climate on net, which means you have to think about not only the carbon storage changes, but the other biophysical feedbacks and energy fluxes. A really common one is the reflectivity or albedo, that if you go out and plant trees in areas that are really snow dominated, planting a bunch of dark trees over a really bright surface can actually warm the climate more than the carbon storage of those trees. So thinking about things like the albedo is important. The second piece is more kind of program design. You have to lead to a change in behavior or additional carbon storage compared to what would have happened anyway. You have to think about shifting activities. So if you protect forests in one area in California and then they're cut down in Oregon, that hasn't accomplished much for the climate. And the fourth is really most relevant to a lot of the work we've been doing. You have to think about the risk to durability and permanence, which is that if we protect forests today, but they burn down next year, that actually hasn't accomplished much for the climate either. So we have to be able to constrain, model, and understand these risks to durability. So what are these risks? Generally in climate policies, they get separated into the natural risks, which are the climate and ecosystem risks, and the human system risks. And the natural risks are a lot of the ones that we are modeling: fire, drought, biotic agents, and other disturbances like tropical cyclones. And then the human system risks are probably also quite crucial, but are quite a bit harder to constrain from data. This might be financial failure of the project, management failures, policy changes, not enforcing environmental regulations, things like that. And so really one of the critical tests for this field is, can we actually constrain these risks from data over a decently long period of time, maybe 50 to 100 years? Because that's the window that you have to count on forests to lock up carbon to have a climate benefit. So the core questions we've been trying to answer in this work are, what are the main natural risks to forests and how do they vary in space? how do these risks affect the long-term projections of forest carbon and the models and forecasts of that? And do different major modeling methods or approaches give similar or diverging answers about the future? And this gets to kind of this bringing multiple tools and multiple approaches to bear. And if they line up, I think we have a lot more confidence. And if they diverge, we can both learn a lot, but maybe we have higher uncertainty and less confidence in these projections. So, couple projects to share with you here. First, we started with US forests and asked, how well can we model wildfire, climate stress that is not fire or insects? So we call this is really drought, but it's kind of broadly climate stress, and insect risks for US forests using this suite of stand structure, the physiological traits and climate variables. What are the historical patterns of these disturbances, and what are the projections in the next century using climate models? So what we did was we built some. These are all now much more just kind of empirical and statistical models. We built these statistical models of burned area from moderate and severe wildfires in forests using satellite data. This is the Landsat 30-meter resolution. It's a data set called MTBS, which stands for Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity. This really goes from 1984 to, in this analysis, 2018. For the climate stress and insect risks, we again relied on this FIA plot data. These are now we're using all US forest data in the contiguous US. So this is about 130,000 plots. And we'll use this whole set of predictors of climate data, forest age, and then this key plant hydraulic trait that I mentioned, or that, well, it's one key diagnostic plant physiological trait of that relating to vulnerability to embolism. That's what this P50 term is. We downscaled 6 different or system models to a 4-kilometer resolution, and we did it for 3 different climate change scenarios, a kind of low to moderate, high, and very high climate change scenario. And we did a huge amount of sort of testing and cross-validation and comparisons against independent data. And we're just making future projections for individual forest types where our historical models performed relatively well in cross-validation. So how do we do? This is showing you now the historical model performance. The modeled is the right-hand column, and the observed data are the left column. Fire burn areas on top, drought or climate stress-driven tree mortality is in the middle, and insect-driven tree mortality is in the bottom. We can, we capture, you can see that basically fire risk is quite high in the Western US, particularly in California. And the drought and insect risks are really highest in the Rocky Mountains, especially kind of the Intermountain West. I want to point out on the observed data set, there's a big hole in Wyoming, and that's not because trees haven't died. That's actually because the FIA data set didn't have enough revisits to actually estimate in Wyoming. So that's not a failure of our models. That's a gap in the observed data right now. For our cross-validated performance, it's actually quite interesting. The fire models work fairly well, and this is because there's a really incredibly strong climate connection in fire, and also because we have so much more data building these models coming from satellite data than from ground plot data. You can see the drought models work the least well, and the insect models are kind of intermediate. And this is not terribly surprising. These are a lot harder to model. They're a lot more complicated, and there's just a lot less data to build these models. And of course, as I mentioned before, there is a lot of covariation in the drought and insect risks that is both ecological and due to this data set driven, that it's not a clean drought attribution in this FIA data set. So these are the, yeah, go ahead, questions.
First, I'm noticing a major discrepancy is the East Coast forest, where it seems like on the left I can see the Appalachian Mountains, roughly speaking, and on the right I don't. And is that a phenomenon where it's like some kind of what's called pest species that kind of are hard to image, like on that mountain range?
Yeah, well, and so that's probably this. It's probably related to a set of beetle species. And one of the challenges here is a lot of those forests are private lands.
Hmm.
A lot of them are sort of large timber companies or privately managed timber companies. Um, and those folks, this FIA data set does have plots on those lands. The Forest Service works really hard to build trust to be able to make measurements on private lands. But actually, when beetles attack those trees, they're often very proactive and they'll go in and cut them out. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about the beetle attack rates there. And our models also just don't capture the sensitivity of those beetle attack rates very well. And you're right, that is kind of one of our large discrepancies is we capture the beetle-driven mortality very well in the West, but not so well in the East.
Okay, and to what extent is satellite data relevant here? Because FIA is like very sparse, you don't quite know where the plots are, but satellite you potentially can see the changing coloration due to well, all causes of mortality. So to what extent can you augment your data?
Yeah, and we've looked a lot at this on how well can you map mortality with satellite data, and we actually have a couple active projects with colleagues and a NASA-funded project to try to do this. The biggest, in my view, the single biggest constraint there is actually the attribution, that it's relatively doable to see that a tree has died, that it's gone from living to dead. And there's different, indices and kind of bands that you can use to detect that. But knowing what killed that tree is often a lot harder. Was this drought? Was this, something else where somebody went in and damaged the tree? And really attributing it to cause is one of the trickiest bits that's really hard to tell from a satellite. Some things like wildfire you can absolutely attribute, right? You can see wildfire pretty well from space. But between the wildfire and clear cutting, which people do, those two are doable, and everything else is really hard to attribute. And that's our main constraint, I think.
Got it. And then just one more. One challenge of any modeling is the stochasticity of the phenomenon, that you cannot predict what's might happen in the historical. So to what extent is this more suited for stochastic prediction and comparing distributions as opposed to picture compare?
So the question is how is thinking about the stochasticity and how do we do that? Is that the question? Yeah, well, and I think this is really, really true with fire, right? Is that we're there's all sorts of stochastic things of where lightning strikes or where people accidentally light a fire. And so we're sort of modeling the average fire risk for a given pixel. But whether lightning struck there or not, that's entirely or very largely stochastic. The main ways we try to think about this in fire is looking a lot at the intraannual variability and trying to capture, really high and low fire years, which are really often kind of weather driven, and that gets us to climate sensitivity. And then thinking about the performance at kind of broader regions that, whether any given pixel burns is very stochastic, but we do know for a given ecoregion that, it's going to have this amount of burn area in an ecoregion. And so we did a lot of these games of cross-validation, both over time with stochasticity and over space, kind of aggregating to try to make sure we're roughly capturing the regional performance as best we can.
Got it. Thank you.
And I should say too, I think the stochasticity of insect outbreaks is also really hard to predict. And I think going forward in US forests, projecting what is going to be the next beetle outbreak is a really hard task. And one of the things that kind of keeps me awake at night is, I think fire, we have relatively solid models, but what might be the next mountain pine beetle that just goes from this endemic to an epidemic phase. It's kind of a population epidemic set of models is just incredibly hard. And that sort of stochasticity and nonlinear dynamics, we're really not capturing in these models.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So using our downscaled climate model data, then we did some projections going forward in these different climate scenarios. And I've called out a couple different regions here. You can see, again, fires the top, climate and drought is the middle, and insects are the bottom. And the red colors are the high climate change scenario, and green are low to moderate. Of course, wildfire, we expect to go up a lot in the West. This is very consistent with a number of different studies using different models. We even start to see some kind of novel wildfire emergence in areas that don't tend to see much right now, like in the Southeast. Drought stress in particular rises in the southwestern US. And this is indeed where we've seen a huge amount of drought impacts in the past 20 years. And then insect-driven mortality really jumps up along, particularly in California and kind of the West Coast. And that's probably also somewhat related to drought, but it's really it's one of the hot spots of insect projections. So this is an example of some of the kind of initial extrapolation we can do from these models. Now, of course, it's worth knowing there are plenty of considerations and limitations of these. We're not including strong fuel feedbacks. We're not including land management decisions, disturbance interactions, invasive species. There's a number of things we're not including here. I think there's actually a lot of reasons why these risk projections could be overestimates or underestimates. If I had to guess from all the work we've done, I think the fire might be slight overestimates, but the drought and insects are probably underestimates. And then one goal of this is to really try to make this all useful and usable to folks. And so we've made all this data and code publicly available. This was a collaboration with the nonprofit called Carbon Plan that we built a tool that we really kind of envision as a Google Maps for forest climate risks for stakeholders. And I'm happy to share that link in the follow-up. So then the next question is, how does this affect carbon? And this is led by a former postdoc in my group, Chao Wu. And what we did here was try to take three different approaches. First, we took this mechanistic process-based approach that comes out of climate models. So this is the change in carbon for US forests coming out of these large-scale climate models. And these models are really trying to simulate the photosynthesis, respiration, and some of the plant physiology of ecosystems. The second is really inspired by our previous work and drew on our previous work. We call this kind of the demographic approach. This is really also what the large forestry literature tends to model forests, which is using growth curves and then a stochastic mortality and disturbance projection, which really comes from that previous analysis I just showed you. And then finally, we used a statistical approach that really comes out of the conservation biology field of these large-scale niche models. And really what these are is just kind of fairly simple random forest models of the total carbon found in forests and modeling individual forest groups. So we split the US into 24 forest groups that the Forest Service uses and built these empirical models of carbon in those groups. And for a policy intersection, we'll look at some of the forest offset projects in California's cap and trade system on these maps. So main initial question here is, do we project for the future of US forests carbon gains on average or carbon losses by the end of the century? And this is comparing the last 2 decades of the 21st century in a moderate emissions scenario compared to this is 1995 to 2014. And the answer was you actually get very different answers depending on the modeling tool or the method used. These Earth system models here are in the upper left, and you can see these Earth system models suggest about a 45% gain in above ground live carbon, and it's a gain almost everywhere, but especially in the east, except for a really small random patch in Texas. I don't know what's going on with Texas there, so can't answer that question. On the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the empirical climate niche models, you actually see a 4% loss in carbon in US forests. And it's this sort of strange mid-Atlantic band, and then the West Coast, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. Looking at the demographic or growth mortality model, this is the one that's built on a lot of FIA and satellite data, and it has on average about a 4% gain. You see slight gains in the Northeast and Great Lakes states and in the Pacific Northwest, and then losses, particularly throughout the Intermountain West and California. The bottom right is the average of these different projections, and the hashing are where there's actually agreement among the three approaches. And there's only really agreement in the Northeast, the Great Lakes, and a few parts of kind of the Northwestern US.
The question, I was curious, these are in raw forest or forest that are managed for carbon?
This is assuming basically that today's management continues unchanged for the 21st century. So this is just asking, if we don't change any management at all, do we think on average forests are going to gain or lose carbon due to climate change?
Right.
And I should mention that, these all have different kind of inputs and strengths and weaknesses. And in particular, the Earth system models have this very strong CO2 fertilization effect, but they don't have good representation of fire and drought, whereas this growth mortality model is built very strongly on all the disturbance data, and so it's kind of capturing those impacts a lot better.
Got it.
And I have to say, there is a lot of uncertainty here, but if I had to pick one category of model that I think is probably most likely how the future is going to play out, it would be this upper right-hand corner of this growth mortality model. And it's largely because this has the key processes and is most consistent with what the past 20 years have looked like, that really we've actually started to see carbon losses from a lot of Western states and generally carbon gains in other places. And then the policy question that's kind of interesting is now we can actually overlay some of these forest carbon offset projects. And just for context, these projects are really required to maintain and grow their carbon over 100 years. And so if we're expecting that they're going to lose carbon due to climate change, that's a real problem for the assumptions going into this piece of the climate program. And of course, it varies again by the modeling approach, but I want to highlight this kind of, I think, most likely set of models in the demographic models. And you can see every circle here now is an existing carbon offset project. Gray circles are projects that we project are likely to lose carbon by the end of the century. And then these histograms are by the number of projects in the middle, and in particularly the area of projects on the right. And in our projections, around 36% of the area in these projects we think is likely to lose carbon. And that's really a lot higher than kind of the insurance mechanisms in this program, which are really set up to cope with maybe an 8% loss in sort of carbon. So that's an interesting piece to keep in mind on how this can inform and really suggest that we need an updating of these protocols to capture these climate risks. And then we've also attempted this multi-method, multi-risk approach analysis for global forests. And I don't have as much about this in terms of the methods, but I'm happy to go into it in questions. And we did this global analysis comparing, again, these same three types of models: the mechanistic or system models, the very empirical climate niche or species distribution models, and then the kind of forestry-based disturbance models. And this is our global risk map that came out of that. Now here, these data sets aren't all in the same unit, so we've actually just plotted them by the percentile in risk space to be able to compare them. And so red colors are on average higher risk areas across data sets, and blue colors are lower percentiles and lower risk lower risk forests. And a couple interesting things jump out here. You can see in the US, you still somewhat see this east to west gradient, that you have lower risks in particularly the Northeast and a lot higher risks in the Southwest. There are really high risks in the southern boreal zone if you look up at Canada here and at least parts of Russia. And then in the Amazon, there's a lot higher risk in the South and East Amazon, which is expected to dry out, and a lot lower risk in the North and West part of the Amazon. And this is consistent with a lot of other studies. So the good news is there are some consistent patterns that make a lot of sense in terms of global risks. The bad news is actually this right-hand parallelogram, which shows you the average correlations between these data sets in terms of their spatial patterns of risks, and they're really quite low, that very few of these are strongly correlated, which tells you that there's just a lot of uncertainty and improvements needed in these different risk data sets. So I think the key messages are using these different sets of models, we can start to bridge tissue level physiology up to whole forest ecosystem responses. And this physiology of plant water transport or plant hydraulics is, I think, quite promising in this area. The nature-based climate solutions really need better data, and especially constraining these risks to durability. And the climate risks to our forests and the nature-based climate solutions then are quite substantial. They are quite uncertain. There's a lot of disagreement, but they're also probably underestimated in current policies and protocols. And so this is, I think, a key gap between the science and the applications and the policy. So quick thanks to my group and to the number of collaborators and funders of this work. And I'm happy to take more questions.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, thank you very much. This was fascinating.